Good evening and welcome to Tamil Heritage Trust's monthly Heritage Talk for March 2024. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Before we begin the talk, here is our usual quick introduction to Tamil Heritage Trust. As many of you are aware, we were established, THT was established in 2010 with the explicit purpose of understanding, appreciating, disseminating, and celebrating India's rich and varied heritage. Towards this, we conduct talks and seminars, the flagship program being the monthly Heritage Talk that we are seeing now, which is held online on the first Saturday of every month. We also have seminars, in-person seminars here in Chennai. One of them is called Pechu Kacheri because it coincides with the Kacheri season in December in the Chennai Kacheri season, music season. The online Indology Festival is held in the first or second week of June. And for example, in the last 2023 edition, we covered the topic of India and the sea. And it took a fascinating journey across and along India's coastline to discover the influence of Indian trade, religion, politics across the oceans. We had 14 scholars deliver talks for us during that Indology Festival. All our talks and seminars are available for viewing on our YouTube channel. You can search for Tamil Heritage Trust at the YouTube channel search box, and which will lead you here. And if you'd like notifications on our next programs and events, please subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to receive those notifications of future events. We also conduct workshops on topics like how to see a temple, how to see a museum, on Pallava Grantha, and so on, as well as site seminars in various heritage destinations across the country. We have an initiative called Alamaravai, which is for teachers for heritage, which encourages and guides school teachers to establish heritage clubs and take the message of heritage to their students in schools. We give away a couple of awards. The first one is Professor S. Swaminathan Heritage Award, named after our co-founder. This is for an individual who does work and has contributed in the area of heritage dissemination, preservation, and so on. The other award is a unique one-of-a-kind award, which is called the Venkaya Epigraphy Award, which is exclusively for people doing work in the area of epigraphy in India. It is named after Sri V. Venkaya, who was India's first Indian epigraphist. And it has been established by his family, and they have entrusted Tamil Heritage Trust with the work of finding the winners annually. If you'd like to stay abreast of all the activities of Tamil Heritage Trust, please send us a line at admin@tamilheritage.in or fill out a small form at bit.ly/THT-join. Going to today's talk, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Andrea Gutiérrez from the University of Texas at Austin, who will be talking on the exciting theme of Tastes of Tamil Land, Recipes and Culinary Practices from History. We'd like to thank Dr. Gutierrez for accepting our invitation and making the time to deliver this talk. Dr. Gutierrez is Assistant Professor of Instruction at the University of Texas at Austin. She has a PhD, 2 MAs, and a BA in Art History. Her 2 research priorities are Food History of South India and Historical Animal Studies, also for South Asia. Her most recent publications include Toward a Better Understanding of Medieval Food Practices, The View from Srirangam, and Elephant Education, Interspecies Communication, Elephant Care Manuals of Early India. Dr. Gutierrez is presently finishing her monograph on Royal Pleasures of Dining in India's History and is actively researching her project on captive elephant history of India. She was awarded the Getty Library Research Grant for work on food history by the Getty Research Institute in 2022. She's a winner of multiple awards, among them the DK Award for Outstanding Doctoral Thesis on Sanskrit and the Specialist Accolade for Dissertation in Humanities from the International Convention of Asia Scholars. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Andrea Gutierrez. Over to you, Dr. Gutierrez.
Thank you so much. So thank you to you, Shyam, for the invitation, and to the Tamil Heritage Trust overall. I'm excited to share some of my work today. I'm going to be giving a talk. Let me share my screen, which is not meant to be exhaustive of all, could we say, all of Tamil food history, but I'm hoping to illuminate particular historical moments, a few texts, and critical periods of history in order to provide some clarity on Tamil food and history. And so my project is beginning to write a history of Tamil food. And more broadly speaking, also for India, for Indian culinary history. And this is a topic that has been largely ignored, as we know, in studying the historical record. So in a sense, it's not that my arguments of today will be earth-shattering, but rather laying the groundwork for a history of food for one region of India and doing some initial historiography or sharing it with you. And the challenge, of course, when working on food history, is that we are hopelessly reliant on written records of texts that are still preserved and still extant today, and that these written records are mostly quite elite, right? Heavily in elite mode of recording about oneself or one's community, or of writing about others through a lens of alterity. And so this means that for a great part of the historical record, records were royal ones or elite ones, elite texts written in cosmopolitan languages like Sanskrit. And so this makes up the bulk of my work as a historian, but we also need to seek out alternative archives, including, although it may not be called alternative, this rich historical archive of Tamil language material. And so I have some of these aspects to share with you today. In a nutshell, today I'm going to be highlighting some aspects about food in the Sangam corpus, give some background on what we are looking for in pre-modern recipes and how to find them, bring some material to light from medieval material, epigraphy, and mostly the Chorta period, and then move on to Tamil material for the early modern, particularly Maratha Tanjavur, and that kingdom, before closing with the print era of early Tamil cookbooks written during the colonial period. You may have noticed already that I've mentioned recipes, food preparation, cookbooks, and I think it's particularly this world of culinary history and not just food history alone that needs attention, right? We have excellent groundwork on sort of the raw materials of food history in older volumes from Om Prakash, individual studies on single food items from P.K. Gode, and we have the prolific writing of K.T. Achaya as well, who worked so wonderfully across different languages. In some cases, when reading his material, some of his findings were erroneous due to reliance on translations of other people, but still he worked so vastly that is a rare specialty indeed. And if we were not going to read texts and culinary writing to find out about food history, our only other option would be, of course, to examine the archaeological record, right? To figure out how cooking was done in the past, looking for things like microfossil remnants of food cooked onto potsherds, ceramic pots, as you find in this key work for the Harappan civilization, which has been sort of described as earliest curry from these different remnants they've found on different pieces of potsherds, or things like seed record for archaeobotany. This was a really recent finding for Southeast Asia, but of preparing spice mixtures on this upside down overturned mixing or grinding table. The legs are shown kind of on the top part there. So anyway, reading culinary history using the written record, right, is the only other way we have for accessing what would be otherwise intangible cultural heritage, right? We can't taste these recipes today. I don't have to tell you that in terms of culinary identity, or even community or clan or family, it really does matter precisely how you prepare your sambhar, biryani, portiol, or kute, whatever it is. Food preparation is closely linked to the value and identity association that we bring to the food we cook and the food we eat and our food preferences. And so this history of food preparation is closely tied to identity and is what has been so ignored in historiography, where we have not had much attention to this quotidian history, as it's called, in a preference for great man history, as it's been described by some, the history of battles, of rulers of influence, and so on. To the sacrifice or the detriment of studying the everyday and how people, the majority of people, really lived from day to day, what they ate, what they drank, and so on. And so here we go. Although I cannot dedicate much time, I need to at least gesture to some of the earliest mentions of food in Tamil, which are not recipes at all, but sometimes describe cooking and food served to bards and other figures in the Tamil Sangam corpus. We find such rich details about food across the Sangam material, but I find, and I feel it's been rather ignored or not getting enough attention, descriptions from the Patu Patu. And so we have descriptions from, I'll wait for a second, descriptions from Madurai Kanchi of approximately 2nd to 4th century of the Common Era. And I follows Vilebel's dating for Sangam material. All sorts of familiar foods to us. We find all sorts of millets, tinai varhe, familiar descriptions of yellow mustard growing in the Kudanji landscape, lushly growing and almost tangled together with ginger, turmeric, black pepper, and more. And this is not surprising at all, right? We expect to find things like this. Some verses later in Madurai Kanchi, we find descriptions of sellers of sweet items selling their wares, including lined or striped honeycomb-like adais, right? Also modicums filled with melted sugar, cooked from sugarcane juice. I'm not saying that these adais were really like ravadosai, but that's the image that at least got evoked in my mind, right? When I thought of like, how could an adai be like honeycomb? And so in Sangam poems, we find really lovely descriptions of food and varied foodscapes, in fact, that can represent the different communities and regions and peoples as they're described. And this also includes non-elite members of society, what food historian Rachel Loudon has called the humble cuisines that most people are eating on a day-to-day basis, which are often so hard to access through the written archive that privileges the other side of the spectrum, the high cuisines, as they're called. And so we do find some of descriptions of high cuisines I might highlight in the Patnapalai of probably 2nd century of the Common Era, where we read about fighters, really wrestlers, eating cooked shrimp from the sea and tortoises from the fields. And so these are smaller tortoises, they're not sea turtles, right? And these have been steamed in this case. This reminded me of descriptions from the 12th century medieval Vikramankabhyudaya, a Sanskrit text composed by Someshvara III of the Chalukyan kingdom. And he describes all kinds this is a description of the royal palace kitchens and the cooks working there, all kinds of seafood and shellfish being cooked in that kitchen or those kitchens, cooking areas, they are cooking stations. And so Patnapalai's cooked tortoises remind us of a twice cooked tortoise dish, also in a related text, the Manasolasa, also written by King Someshvara III of the 12th century. And the recipe for that from the Anabhoga section of the Manasolasa is that we are instructed to roast little turtles. So again, this is definitely not sea turtle, right? Roast little turtles on the fire, remove the legs, shell, and head, marinate the meat in citron juice or something comparably sour to soften them. soak in oil or ghee, and then coat them in a coating of spice powders, and then roasted or cooked on a spit fire, right? And we also have another variant recipe for how to prepare those tortoises in that cookbook. So Meshverda reminds us, in case you didn't know, that turtle meat tastes like cooked plantain. And this dish is called Nandyavarta in this text. You get soft, tasty, delightful turtles. This was quite a delicacy. So Meshverda tells us. Also from the sangam material in the Puranarattrapadai, we find descriptions of royal dining similar to what we find in the same Sanskrit text, the Manasalasa, the Chalukyan Manasalasa, descriptions of eating spit roasted mutton. This is sheep meat, right? So since I moved on to this royal context of dining, we find also in one of the Patapatas, in the relatively short Sirupanatrapadai, which dates to the latter half of the 3rd century of the Common Era, we find an unexpected allusion to a cookbook of fame. When the bard, the poet, is praising the hospitality of Chieftain Naliakoran, what better way to pay a compliment to the host than to declare that the food he serves must have been prepared using the cookbook of none other than Bhima, esteemed chef of Mahabharata fame. This lyric poem is describing the landscape to guide poets from place to place, to minor kingdoms, wealthy chieftains like this Manan, who could patronize their work, right, and support them, right? And here we find the poet near the end of the poem declaring that Naliakodan's generosity, this is the quote I've shared with you, is so great he will stand there feeding you in shining golden vessels, many dishes that follow the preparation methods from the learned treatise of delicacies composed by Bhima, right? So he's described as this snowy mountain-chested man who is older than Arjuna. This poem, of course, is quite erudite, or feels that way to us today, reading, but it was evident that kings and courtiers, elite members listening to this poem would definitely have caught the compliment. And presumably all listeners even today know of Bhima's fame as chef cooking in royal kitchens, right? As we see during the forest sojourn in hiding of a sort. And so we find this motif or this meme across popular media representations of the Mahabharata that we see a lot of today. And this would have been immediately recognizable to those listening to the bard at the time. It's particularly Bhima's hand and knowledge of cooking that can be almost tasted in this chieftain's food. And so it turns out this 3rd century or so time period was a particularly popular epoch for referring to Bhima as the very best in culinary techniques and skill. We see Bhima again as master chef in the 3rd to 4th century Panchatantra verse. Really, this verse is meant to illustrate how noble figures like kings must be humble and get down to do hard and dirty work sometimes in times of hardship, right? But we find highlighted in this poem, again, there's a popular motif or meme getting passed around in all kinds of literature, right? Also, I have to say, Nala is our other famous chef, or very, very famous chef of epic fame. And really it is Nala that gets quoted more often in terms of authorship for recipes across the culinary literature of India, whether it's single recipes or his cookbook, the Nala Pakadarpana, the Nala's Mirror on Cooking, as I translate it. Of course, this is a pen name, but so we have quite a bit more, many more references to Nala and his cooking and his recipes, but we do also have cookbooks by Bhima in the manuscript record. We have, let's see here, yes, one unfortunately very corrupt Sanskrit manuscript. This was my title slide as well, of a Sanskrit text with Kannada commentary that's held in Chennai. in the Government Oriental Manuscript Library. Also another in Sanskrit that I got copies of and I'm still working, have not yet worked with. This is a Sanskrit text with a Newar commentary. And so this is a Bhima Virachita Supakarta Shastra Vidi. We do actually have cookbooks penned by Bhima as well. And so it's not just this sort of illusory idea of fame. So to approach our material correctly for culinary history, we can't go in with assumptions that we may have from our present day of life about what a recipe should look like. The verbiage and the structure of pre-modern recipes were actually very, very different, vastly different from how recipes look today, right? This is especially true for the pre-modern era. I call pre-modern what is ancient and medieval, anything before early modern to modern. And so since recipes are cultural constructs, they vary significantly from language and community to another. According to historical linguist Francisco Alonso Almeida, he has done the most theorization on recipes and recipes in history. He says that pre-modern recipes really need only have one stage or part, it's called a stage, of a recipe to be considered a recipe, right? As found in texts. And he says you have to have ingredients listed, right? I differ from him somewhat. I suggest that you need to have at least two stages, right? Two parts. If we have only ingredients listed, which we occasionally do find, as I've encountered, there's a really amusing and curious text written in Sanskrit called the Girvanavan Manjari, Bouquet of Speech for God. Really, it's a text for learning Sanskrit, so you've got lots of vocabulary. We see a whole list of different ingredients that the boy is going to be sent out to market to buy, right? And so this is not a recipe, it's going to be cooked into different things, right? It's just a list. So I say we need to have at least two of these stages as I've listed them here. Stages include things like preparation method, the name of the dish, serving suggestions. Sometimes, and we do often find this for the ancient and medieval period, the virtues or benefits of the dish, the effects of eating, right? And so that may be on the body or otherwise. Other stages we don't find until the modern period, right? Things like numbers of servings. So we need to know what to look for in pre-modern recipes and also what not to look for to see how different they are. What does a pre-modern recipe look like, right? And so, of course, this depends on the archive that you find it in, right? I've shared here a Chinese recipe for contrast. Sorry, one from a medieval Chinese cookbook dated to the 13th century from an edition that just came out this past year, in the last half of the year. And so this might or might not look like a recipe for us. As you see, the Chinese text is very brief indeed, but we definitely have enough stages or parts to be considered a pre-modern recipe. I've included this one because these are pickles, basically what she's making here. And she advises at the end, this method is not for those in a rush to eat them, which I think is pretty amusing for pickle making, right? We find remarkably, as I've explored in the Chorta period material, Chorta recipes quite exceptionally include dish name, a list of ingredients, and also something we don't normally find in pre-modern recipes, measurements or volumes of the ingredients to be used, right? This is for preparing temple offerings. This last detail is not often found in pre-modern recipes. If you're really lucky for early recipes, you might get ratios or proportions, but that's maybe, 2% of the cases, right? And so we have a really amazing situation for the Chorta recipes. But what is absent from the Chorta material is any sort of indication of how to prepare the dish, which is often what would be needed to clue us in a bit more. As you see, I've already moved on to the medieval period here to explore what I am calling temple recipes recorded in stone, in donative inscriptions. I'm going to highlight for our discussion today one recent finding of mine, one specific donative offering given to the god and still given to the god in the Chidambaram temple. And I'll shed light on a few more commonly held assumptions for temple food. Overall, in the Chorta period, we have heightened energy and attention and money devoted to temple ritual practices, much more than in prior periods, much more than in Pallava material, where you have these great prashastis and inscriptions, but at the most, you might have ghee for lamps, lighting lamps and things like that in the record. So we have much more attention and money on ritual temple practices. And this also includes, because of much more money and investment, an amazing record, increased inscriptional information about temple food offerings. We are so fortunate. Here's just a sample. So you see the material that I was working from, generally speaking. These are readily available on archive.org, all of these volumes. We're really fortunate to have such a record, especially for South India and the inscriptional record. More inscriptions are still being brought to light, as you well know, if you follow Tamil Heritage Trust. Inscriptions in South India far surpass the numbers of inscriptions for the rest of the number, and for the rest of India, sorry. And it's especially significant for Tamil material, right? As you are no doubt familiar. And the Chorta period, we see also this marked rise of inscriptional writing. And this period was obviously a period of great growth, development for temple structure, for temple architecture, right? But I suggest also development of greater complexity for temple ritual practices into increasingly complex forms, and then the crystallization of those forms as a regular thing for these practices. I don't have to tell you that the temple was a center of economic life for villages and towns, but because inscriptions were meant to be a very public declaration of financial matters, of donations to temples, of tax exemption on land, or of exemption on the produce grown from that land, like agricultural products, right? Of how money was to be donated on what. Because of this, we have a very detailed record with sums of money in gold coins and similar to be directed toward food offerings. Naivedya, sometimes indicated in this record as Nivedya or Tiruamadu, right? Tiruvamadu, to be given to deities in temple. And so the only reason why I've been able to find recipes at all for dishes offered to gods is because money matters, right? Money mattered. If a donor donated X amount of money, he or she, and it was often she, wanted to be sure exactly how that money was spent on each food offering, and in some cases, in rare cases, how much money was to be spent for each ingredient required to prepare a naivedyam. And so these portions are what I call recipes in the donative inscriptional record. These are actually quite rare, right? Out of the thousands of inscriptions, I mean, we have maybe 20 or 40, perhaps. I have not read through, obviously, every inscription ever, so we may have as many as 100 or something. At first glance, these don't even seem to be recipes sometimes, because you may have values in coins or rice paddy kind of lumped together per ingredient, and then later parsed out and divided to be distributed to each naivedya. So you might have a list of various food offerings given and a certain amount of rice paddy to pay for all of the sugar, and then it'll list this amount of paddy to pay for sugar for this offering, and this amount for that offering, and this amount for that offering, and then the same is repeated for dal, whatever the case might be, spices and so on. And so since they're grouped together differently, it doesn't openly look like a recipe, right? But because it is possible to isolate names of dishes, let's see what I've got here, with a corresponding measure or volume of grain and spice and dal and so on, we certainly have stages of recipes that we can reassemble, right? Ingredients listed, measurements, and so on. So it's certainly enough to be pre-modern recipes. And so I'll show you, these are two different appams. I'm not sure if it's going to be cooked exactly as we find today in Sri Rangam. And in parallel, approximately 1 century apart, these sort of different preparations for appam. Now, there's another Naivedya from an inscription that I was unable to figure out years back when I was first reading through and scanning thousands of pages of inscriptions. So this offering was to be given at Chidambaram. I couldn't figure out what it was. Also, the inscription was incomplete, so we're missing at least one ingredient, so I just put it aside, right? I returned to this inscription some years later. It had been such a mystery to me. What could this offering be with jackfruit, eggplant or brinjal, and sugar? Like I just said, the inscription was illegible, at least for one line, which actually often happens. I figured we would never find out what this, I would never figure out what this dish really was. Part of the confusion came from the name as it was recorded in the inscription. This was called Sitapaka Amadu. Maybe you would translate it as a special cooked offering, or maybe excellent or wonderful. Really, the name did not illuminate at all of what this dish was, right? It was only, after some time it finally clicked and it came to me. What we had was the oldest record, the oldest recipe for an offering still given today to the Chidambaram Nataraja, and this was a Chidambaram Gotsu. Remember, it's not called this in the inscription itself, but I have recognized this has to be it. This is the Goju or Gotsu, right? And it was this combination of jackfruit, I guess, with brinjal or aubergine that led me astray, as well as the sugar, although we commonly do find that in gotsus or in gojus. So it should have been obvious. In any case, this inscription had recorded an offering made possible by a gift of land to the temple that was purchased from a land-owning woman, Madevanchati. And this was purchased by a gentleman living at a mutt in Tiruvannamalai, and so then he gave it to the temple. The combination of sweet, sour, savory, and bitter flavors is very common in gotsus. I should not have been at all surprised at the typical inscription of sugar. Here, addition of sugar, sorry, I'm thinking too much about inscriptions. And so in the photo here, you see the lovely work of my collaborator, Deepa Reddy, who I've been working with to recreate all sorts of historical recipes for my research. And so her culinary work is available through her blog and her Instagram. You can look up Deepa Reddy at padishahi.com or on Instagram, as I said. That's the little plug, but she's been a fantastic collaborator. So with the mystery of this gotsu finally resolved, there's still two more things about Naivedya, right, and mostly medieval temple culture that I want to share with you today. The first regards the practice of eating Naivedya in temples after offering to the deity, and the second concerns what the word sambhara indicated in the inscriptions. In spite of the popularity of eating prasad or prasadam today at temples across South India, right, Naivedya in the past was not always eaten after offering to the deity in the temple. Now, this may come as something of a surprise, although we take it so for granted today. And so it is, interestingly, but perhaps not so surprisingly, during the Chorta period that we find this transition to consuming the offerings to temple deities. While it is certainly uncontroversial that the practice of giving food to gods was widespread over many historical periods in South Asia, this certainly intensified during the medieval period, it was not without controversy, means it was controversial to eat the food after giving it to God. This is something that happens outside of the ritual itself, right? And so this controversy came to a head during the Chorta period. It was a point of contention, especially for the Sri Vaishnava community. The human consumption of Naivedya, again, I'll make sure it's clear, forms no part of the ritual puja itself, as you probably know, or maybe don't. So thus this development into a practice, right, is worth tracing. It's worth sort of locating, right, and see how this happens. Since the human devotee's consumption of Naivedya is not part of the puja, right, really might be understood better as waste products of a ritual, and this is how we find it described in texts often. Sometimes this would be treated as special waste, right? Whether or not it was considered impure, still uchishta, right? These sort of leftovers. Sometimes, of course, the Nivedya and Nirmalya garlands that are used were enjoyed after, and so we see a bit of both. There's no consistency, right? And this makes the later sort of uptick in the practice of, as we see it today, always eating prasad, right? All the more remarkable, right? And we have certainly obvious that by the Vijayanagara period of the 14th to 17th centuries, we have abundant evidence of gifting or returning the prasad as temple honors, whether it's returned to a patron or a donor or distributed as temple honors. So clearly we have to look to a period before the Vijayanagara period, to the preceding Chola era, for the development of this practice. We find a handful of inscriptions that do record consuming Naivedya after it had been used in temple services, and we have special instructions for how to distribute it. This is just a handful of cases, right? And of course, it may have been a more frequent activity than the inscriptional evidence suggests, right? We can't really figure that out, right? So it actually probably was much more likely consumed, right? Because we already find the discussion in an 11th century text in Yamunacharya's Agama Pramanya, which I'm going to come to in a moment. And so eating Naivedya really comes up as a form of debate, something that was debated, right, in this text, where we have a defense for eating the food that was already given to God. Sometimes in inscriptions, we find temple workers receive portions of the food offerings. And so this falls more or less in line with Mimamsic interpretation, right? Of where you have a patron or yajamana who also shares in eating the oblation, as well as the priests, due to his connection to the rite. And so these temple workers, as we see also in practice today, right? Whether it's priests and so on, as well as donors, receive a portion of their donation back again. We do find, though, that the incidence of inscriptions that mention humans receiving food after offering to a deity increases significantly over the Chora period. And we have the largest number of references, as I've highlighted, really over a significant number of references for the 13th century. Yeah, we see a big spike. So clearly something is happening in this period. 12th century, we just don't have much evidence. That's why it looks so low too. Most likely we have a gradual increase, right? A gradual shift from the 9th to the 13th centuries. So I started to look for more context on this issue in this text that I've just mentioned, the Agama Pramanya. And this is a defense in response to critics who were firmly against the consumption of temple Naivedya. Ritual leftovers were technically uchishta, meant to be disposed of as with other ritual offerings, whether that might be put in a natural body of water and so on. And so we find this debate written up fairly extensively in this text by Yamunacharya, and he was Ramanujan's teacher, really a significant figure for Vaishnava thought. So we read in the Agama Pramanya that already by the 11th century, Vaishnavas were eating Naivedya that had been offered to gods. Yamuna is recording the critiques from other figures that came up against them, right? And so these critiques were from Smarta Brahmins who adhered to a more pure Vedist way of life, Mimamsakas and others also. We have all sorts of criticisms and critiques that he records in this book. People who would be living off of what was given in the temple, like that's their mode of livelihood, right? And this is an accusation of being abrahmana, not abrahmanical, right? For eating the offering. And so Yamuna takes it in turn to defend against these critiques, saying he has a whole range of defenses, right? He says, who's going to waste all of this food, right? That's a very sort of approach to a common man, right? Then he turns a sort of philosophical twist on us and says, okay, if you say we shouldn't eat these leftovers, then that means That means they are really leftovers that someone has enjoyed or consumed. And if you acknowledge that someone has consumed or enjoyed these, that means you're acknowledging our God as legitimate, right? As physically present in the temple, which is, of course, something that sectarian rivals would not have accepted, right? And so he's kind of twisting the argument back on them, convincingly suggesting that if you're saying we can't eat this because it's leftovers, then the God is present in temple and has eaten it, right? Or at least enjoyed in whatever form. Because otherwise it would just be plain untouched food, as he writes, right? As it turns out, right? I don't want to make this seem like this is particularly a Vaishnava practice exclusively, right? Because we really do have more inscriptional evidence of Shaivite devotees consuming offerings after the food is given to God than we have in Vaishnava temples. This, of course, is just a corollary of the fact that we have patronage of many more Shaivite sites during the Chora period. So this is not particularly significant in itself, but I just don't want you to take away the idea that it was only Vaishnava community members eating Naivedya after offering. So it's safe to say, though, that these were still definitely critiqued and contested practices for the 11th century. And really, it's only over this long 12th century, you might say, partly with the writings of Ramanujan, that we find social crystallization and confirmation of what was previously a contested practice, so much so that by the 13th century, we see this uptick in the record, right? We also find during this time inscriptional evidence of the term prasadam referring to a consumable that's consumed after having offered food to a deity at this same period. And so what I'm saying here, given in this case, in this instance, to processional deities, these processional deities when they were on one procession, what I'm saying here is that traditionally, the term prasadam had this sort of abstract sense of grace or hospitality, right? And at least we find what seems to be concrete confirmation of actual physical material consumable of prasadam consumed by people after offering a naivedya. And so perhaps this was the initiation of using this term prasadam in this new way. Yeah. So next, I want to share with you a few details about Sambhara and how we find Sambhara or Sambhardam in the inscriptional record. This will lead into my next time period as well. So we have various inscriptions that describe donations for food offerings, and they mention in sort of Sanskritic Tamil Sambhardam. Right? And so scholars of Chora history who have written about these instances have typically translated this sambhardam as an offering of sambhar. So they'll just say sambar, rice, vegetables, so on, right? And I think this is a disservice, perpetuating a misconception that these gods and temple devotees would have been given sambar. And I mean the sambar of a sort of tangy, soupy dal and vegetable dish that you may have already eaten today, or maybe having soon after listening to this, right? If we look at two inscriptions from Srirangam, I'm showing you one here. Both instances utilize the term sambhardam in the middle of a list of amadus given to Vishnu, right? But in both cases, sambhardam is not designated as an amadu itself. So this means it is not, or most likely, not a cooked offering, but is clearly edible and consumable. It's included in a list of other foods, right? And other things you consume. So this, what could this be, right? What could this sambhardam be? Historically, I will tell you, the term sambhara in Sanskrit culinary texts has exclusively referred to spices and seasonings, sort of flavoring mixture, typically dried or ground, that the cook has ready to use or that he prepares on the spot to add to a dish, right? Even as late as the 17th century, in the food encyclopedia, the Bojana Kutuchalam, composed in the Deccan, we find sambarda as the descriptor or label that heads the section of shlokas explaining what each spice is. So you have one shloka for omam and one shloka for black pepper, one for long pepper, and so on. And so it's clear sambarda refers to spices, right? Seasonings throughout the culinary record for Sanskrit, right? I suggest that these Tamil inscriptions written in a Tamil that is so heavily inflected in Sanskrit or with Sanskrit actually indicate prepared spice mixtures offered to the deity, right? And that this would be the standard semantic value for this period and for Sanskritic contexts, as we find other sort of Sanskrit tasting words or looking words in the inscriptions as well, right? And so if we look at the 16th century Sri Rangam inscription, the Naivedya offered to Vishnu includes a cooked vegetable offering and many spices or spice mixtures, right? I don't know if you want to call this masala, but you get the point, right? And a ghee offering as well. And so if this Sanskritic Tamil record of Sambardam is talking about spice mixtures, as I argue, then how did the soupy dish that we have come to call sambar today, that we know of as a sort of mainstay of the Tamil diet, how did this soupy dish come to be called sambar, right? Well, it is not, as the popular legend tells it to you across popular media, which you're probably familiar with, where we're supposed to believe sambar was supposedly originated and developed as a composite Maratha Tamil dish, created accidentally in the kitchens of King Shahaji II, and that this was, cooked up and served to Sambhaji, right? The son of Shivaji, and supposedly this is the namesake for sambar, right? That Sambhaji liked it so much, he called it sambar. Well, no, right? Of course, this is a point of contention for the Bhonsle clan, but really, I argue it is by way of synecdoche that the spice mixture sambarda became the cooked dish sambar that requires a prepared spice mixture for its preparation. Yeah, and so one component, the spice mixture added while cooking, gave the name to the whole, right? Where the part stands for the whole. And so this is the same sort of linguistic process that we see today. If we say something like Talai in the sense of a head of state, of course, we're not talking only about like a literal head of Talai. Really, the head has come to stand for, the part has come to stand for a whole human body, and not just a human body, but a special one, right? At that. And I've provided a second example, because this is a food talk, to illustrate synecdoche, where someone may give you some food and you taste it, and they ask you, upu sarya, and they're not really only asking about the upu, right? They're not only asking if there's enough salt, they're asking about all sorts of seasoning. Does it have enough flavoring? Does it taste good, right? So the upu or salt comes to stand for much more, right? This discussion of sambar has already led me to my next historical period that I've alluded to, the Maratha Tanjavur kingdom, that was so generative of new texts and ideas on food. Everything from commissioning the latter two parts of the three parts of the Sanskrit Bojana Kutuchalam, completed around 1700, all the way through royal records, recording recipes that the chefs were cooking in the palace kitchens in 2 different years. And so it's in one of these 2 moments when the palace asked the chefs for recipes that they used that I want to pause now. Now you might be thinking, Maratha Tanjavur kingdom was not terribly Tamil, but the Marathas in fact promoted such a multilingual cultural enterprise as their project. We see this across the arts and literature produced at the time, whether it would be a play, a drama in Sanskrit, Tamil, and Telugu, right? Or all sorts of multilingual commissions for new compositions under the auspices of these Maratha rulers. And so most of these compositions on food were written in Sanskrit or Marathi at the time, as we find, for example, in the handwritten records of written in Modi script Of these two sets of recipes that I just mentioned, of recipes prepared in the palace kitchens from 1816 and from 1825, right? And you may know of this, these two collections or two sets of recipes through an edition published in the 20th century from Saraswati Mahal that has come under the name of Sarabendra Pakashastra or Serfoji's Pakashastra. Now, this title is misleading because neither of these two sets of recipes contain the word Pakashastra at any part on any page, right? To my knowledge. This term is a modern scribal designation from the second half of the 20th century, right? That has been given to these two separate, totally separate sets of recipes, right? These sets were never joined together at any one time as one thing until this print publication came out. I have the 1988 edition. They just came out with another one. They reissued or re-edited this past year in late fall, I think. And so perhaps it would be better to call these kitchen transcriptions, right? They're saved in two totally separate bundles of royal records, yeah? But they're both firmly datable, right? Firmly dated, and remarkable treasure troves that we have here. Let's see what I have here. Oh yeah, I'm showing you another page here from the 1825, one version of the 1825 text. And so another thing that's problematic, if you have read this edition, because I think maybe perhaps you are quite involved in South Indian food history and so on, it's also a disservice that in this print edition, the editor, Mahadik, really says one set of recipes is representative of Maratha cuisine and the other English cuisine. Okay, so this is half true. The 1825 set of recipes does call itself Angrezi or Yingrezi. It's spelled differently in different places, but that's fine. And so, okay, that would be partly true, right? But the earlier collection from 1816 at no point self-identifies as Maratha or Marathi recipes. This is purely a modern label. Again, I just want to clarify, right? Of course, there are Maratha recipes in that set of recipes, right? Things like sandage, the prepared spice mixture, since we've been talking about spice mixtures. But we don't see the word Maratha or Marathi labeling the collection itself, right? As it turns out, this one that does self-identify as Angrezi or Ingrezi actually also has lots of Tamil recipes, Tamil dishes recorded with Tamil names, right? Also, the recipes, the text, the food preparation method has lots of borrowings from Tamil language that have been kind of just written out again in Marathi, right? Just change the spelling. That's recorded in these recipes. In this edition, we find, or this collection, sorry, we find things like poricha korumbu, right? Or coconut kute, dishes that are undeniably Tamil, right? In both name and form. And so we have a mixture of cuisines in this set of recipes. What I argue is Serfoji's promulgation of cosmolocal, I'm calling it cosmolocal culinary cultures. They're cosmolocal in the sense that they're cosmopolitan because they're Sanskritic, also cosmopolitan because we have royal dishes, meaty dishes, also cosmopolitan because they were used to entertain and please foreigners, East India Company officers, tastes and sensibilities. Here, I mean, we have recipes for gingerbread, jellies, and so on. But also, these recipes are terribly local in taste, as the kutus and the kurumbus illustrate. Yeah. And so it is in this, I think this is, it is in this 1825 set of recipes with the kutus and the korumbus where we find the recipes for sambhar. I've already showed you where you have sambhar actually as this soupy, sour dal, if you want to call it that. It is not in the earlier 1816 set of recipes that has things like meatballs, sandage, as I mentioned, payasam, all kinds of classics, right? And I'm reiterating this because the sambhar dishes appear in this Tamil and Ingreji section and not in the section that has Maratha dishes, right? And this is hopefully to put to rest once and for all this Maratha claim that they're particularly Maratha, because if sambar was a Maratha invention, then surely it should be in the set of recipes with more Maratha leaning food, right? And so since I've already alluded to it here, I'll just show it to you, right? This is one of the two recipes for sambar. We have sort of a classic Tamil neem flour sambar, although who knows how commonly it's still prepared today, right? Well, it was prepared last year in my honor by Deepa Reddy, as you see here. So I had the pleasure of delighting in this luscious royal sambar, right? Which may also be an everyday sambar. And so we see in this translation, as I've recorded it here, the seasonings, it's not just seasonings and spices that are called sambar. The sambar here is used to refer to the whole dish, the dish as a whole, right? And the seasoning has a different term, well, because this is written in Marathi. But what I mean to say with this is that it is possible to say that there is Maratha involvement in how the term sambar came to be this dish that you see pictured here, right? That's recognizable to us as sambar. So this means that this sort of bonsle charitra of imaginary, we created sambar kind of thing, there is some point of truth. There's always, when you have these sort of mythology stories or origin stories, there's always part truth, right? You just have to isolate which part is true. And so what we have during this time period is a lot of texts written in Sanskrit, and courtly and scholarly community, no doubt reading these texts written in Sanskrit, very familiar with the Bojana Kutuhulam that I just mentioned, where we see sambarda as spice mixtures. We know this was a popular text and certainly read. We have an abundance of copies of the manuscripts in Saraswati Mahal, and we even have a Marathi translation that isolates only the recipes from the Bojana Kutuhulam, right? And so we definitely there was certainly readership of this text. It's without a doubt that it was popular, and so people knew sambarda was seasonings. And it's most likely, during this period and located here that we got the name, right? Not the creation of the dish, but perhaps the name, certainly by Sanskrit using communities, right? And finally, it would be remiss if I did not at least move on to the colonial period and print era material, because we finally do have, for Tamil, the first cookbooks in Tamil, right? And so the first print cookbooks in Tamil are actually the first cookbooks in Tamil that are fully fledged or fully fleshed cookbooks, right? And so I want to have a just brief discussion, kind of putting material in context, and also putting the Tamil cookbooks in relation with other regional cookbooks and in other vernacular languages of India being printed at the time. Now, if you do know of, or if you have some early handwritten cookbook that it precedes this print era material, if it's in your family collection or whatever, please tell me. Please let me know. I would love to be wrong on this one. Yeah, especially if it's something from the 19th century, early 20th century, right? But in general, this latter half of the 19th century is the time when we see the first flourishing of all sorts of books printed in India, right? And beyond as well. And so I'll try to do a little bit of justice to the topic here. I want to make clear, we do have, we do have cookbooks obviously circulating in English and from Europe, right? That no doubt inspired in some way the local production of cookbooks for Tamil and for the Tamil region. But I'm not saying that Tamil cookbooks or Bengali cookbooks were in any way imitative of or derived from the English language publications that were definitely circulating, as I just showed you. I think I've messed up my slides a bit. These are the cookbooks, or a few. There were at least 5 that Serfojee had in his personal collection for his pleasure, for the court's pleasure in the 19th century. But this is not a case of Tamil cookbooks coming out. Of course, it's a response to European print cookbook writing, but we see something different. I argue that it is rather from circulating European cookbooks in response to rising pressure to adapt to British imperial culinary forms of expression, dietary forms, that we see this response, which is a great desire to promote, here I'll just show you again because I didn't stop on this slide, traditional culinary arts of the region, right? To create a more public sensibility of local community identity bound by culinary cultures. And that this is how these Tamil and other vernacular language cookbooks played a formative role in bolstering this community identity. Something's happened with my slides. And so we find in the second half of the 19th century, an identity that stands in direct contrast to the British ruling authority in colonial India. Let's see, as you might find here, right? Traditional methods, right? And so that this is meant to be a response, not a literal challenge, but a response showing the need to preserve, maintain, teach, educate about, and continue cooking these traditional forms in the face of the hegemonic culinary forms imposed by the British or preferred, or whatever the case might be, whether this is, eating with forks, having toast and tea, and so on. And so we see this project of self-conscious, deliberate assertion and reassertion, at least in an ideal form, of these valued cultural practices and traditional food processing methods and techniques and technologies. And so you can see from this chart that print cookbooks in Tamil are not the earliest print cookbooks published on the Indian subcontinent. We have earlier Bengali, but they are among the earliest. Yeah, we definitely have Tamil cookbooks before the Marathi and any other language. Gujarati is at least 50 years later. So we have quite a bit earlier than the first print cookbooks in Tamil. We have this Bengali, the first on my left, Pakrajeshwar or Byanjo Ratnakar from 1831. But this is a Royal Commission, a sort of encyclopedia on food, some recipes, some other information on food that fits much more in line with the thing I've been showing you, the Bojana Kutuhalam, right? That sort of a food encyclopedia with recipes. Still, this Pakrajeshwar is the oldest vernacular work on food. Of course, maybe this debate is this claim is debatable because we have sort of Urdu, Persianate cookbooks that are earlier. I didn't include it on the slide, but I could have. We have a Telugu cookbook that was translated into English, and this is very early, 1836. This was translated into English, so we only preserve the English translation of this cookbook that was translated by one of the Kavali brothers, who may be known to you. This was translated by Kavali Venkata Ramasamy. And so this publication is in English, which is, I guess, why I didn't include it on my slide, but it is entirely a South Indian production of and on South Indian food and translated from a Dravidian language. So we do have, some preservation and a very early date for this cookbook, right? For cookbook production of South Indian dishes, as you can clearly see here, right? The point is not just to be first, but, just to share some of the context, what's happening at the time. And so this is also translated from Telugu Pakashastra, right? The first Tamil cookbook that I've been able to locate already is in a second edition by 1867, so perhaps first printed in 1866, or we don't know. And this is simply called a Pakashastra of Kashi Vishwanatha Mudaliar. The next earliest is the text you can see in the middle on my slide, the Nalavima Pakashastram of Kandasamy Mudaliar. And this is the one that sees quite a few reissues, reeditions, and quite a few, and then the book gets built onto, it gets bigger and bigger. And then on the left here, you see this Indu Pakashastram of T.K. Ramachandra Rao. This book in the middle actually is quite curious. It's called Nalavima, from Nala and Bhima, and it does remarkably have some content translated into Tamil from the Sanskrit Nala Pakadarpana, the Sanskrit cookbook, medieval period, that I already mentioned to you. So we have a lot of treasures to learn about here, as I've written in my dissertation and elsewhere, and also forthcoming for my book. Today, I just want to place these cookbooks in perspective, also with the first female authored cookbooks. This was from my chart, pink authors are the female authors. And so you can see here, Samael Newell of 1922, already in second edition, is a book no one knows about. If you have a copy or have access to parts of it, please let me know. This is the only book I don't have. And this is so much earlier than the book that everybody knows, right? Where is it? Samite Depart, right? Cook and See, which only saw the English translation in print after Meenakshi Ammal died. And so the Tamil female cookbook authors actually come quite a bit, and I mean, at least 4 centuries, or 3 or 4 centuries later, decades, 3 decades later than other cookbooks that we see authored by women in other parts of India with large print cookbook production. Well, large. And by this I mean in the other presidency areas of the British Raj. So if we're looking, for example, here in the print area around Madras, right, as a sort of center of Tamil culinary writing, although cookbooks were also printed in other locations in Tamil Nadu, we have similar huge centers of culinary writing in both Kolkata and Bombay, right? And in both Kolkata and the Bombay presidency areas, we have very early cookbooks written by women, right? For Bengali speaking areas, we have a Pak Prabandha from 1879. Yes, and she unfortunately chose to remain anonymous, but that's really the second Bengali cookbook, right, in print. And also for Bombay area, Bombay presidency area. Also, the second cookbook in Marathi is written by a woman named Parvati Bai, and she wrote, long title here, the Masapaka Nishpati Atava Matsyadik Prakara Tayar Karne. I don't speak Marathi, I apologize, but this was printed in 1883 in Pune. And so very early title, very early publication, and it may be obvious from this title, if you can, if you understood any of my massacred Marathi, a lot of meat dishes in this cookbook. Yes, quite a few. The publisher in the introduction says that this cook Parvati Bai is a good Hindu lady, but most of the cookbook is meat, and the third part of the 3 in the cookbook is dedicated to Muslim style meat preparations. I'm pointing this out because it is actually in line with what we find with the Tamil material. The Indu Pakashastram, gosh, you can see here one slide. This is the only vegetarian cookbook that I have found for the early period, generally speaking. There may be one other, but much later, like 1920s, 1930s. And so all of the other cookbooks have meat recipes, and not just meat recipes. If we look at this Nalavima Pakashastra, the one in the middle, of course, Nala and Bhima are great Hindu heroes, right? It's not vegetarian at all. We find Muslim identifying recipes in this Nalavima Pakashastram. Organ meats, I mean, lengthy sections, and particularly Muslim identifying seems to be, right? And the author, Kandasamy Mudaliar, even credits his sources of authority for Muslim recipes. He says he consulted with Ahmed Hussein, right, to get this section. So he's doing an archival project, right? It's a much more comprehensive project, recording all sorts of cultural facets. The aim is to preserve and teach cultural practices, right? Not a sort of sectarian divisive project, right? And so I have to at least mention, my discussion would not be complete on 19th century recipe writing and cookbook writing if I didn't at least acknowledge the historical situation, right, of what's going on when these new cookbooks are coming out in print. We have such great flourishing of culinary writing at this time. But we cannot forget that cookbook authors like Wyvern, former colonel, right, with his culinary jottings of Madras, were writing cookbooks with hundreds of pages on food and hundreds of recipes, right? At the very same time, check the year, as the Madras famine of 1875 to 1878. The Nalavima Pakashastram was written right on the heels of this awful famine. In Bombay as well, the cookbook publishing is right at this very moment, right? Well, Pune and Bombay, and was also a region that suffered greatly in this horrific famine. That the composition of these two first Marathi cookbooks is at this exact historical moment of great hunger and death. Yeah, and also likely in response, although whatever it may be, of imagining this project of food for all sorts of communities and so on. I'm not going to end on this sad or horrific note, so I'll point to other sorts of developments of the time, and ones that are written in the cookbooks themselves, ideals of reform, ideals in women's education. And so we have really a whole long line. This quote here, of course, Ramachandra Rao is saying that girls need to go to school and learn reading and writing and arithmetic, but also the art of cooking. Well, it is what it is, but this was also the time of the first schools for girls, and so that is significant, right? That we're seeing culinary writing also geared specifically at women, right? There's a whole long line of culinary writing in these early Tamil cookbooks that I don't have time for today, and that certainly needs attention. But I wanted to at least bring this material to our minds, and perhaps awaken our stomachs as well, by this point in the talk for sure. And I hope to have demonstrated the need for much more attention and additional study on these rich archives of Tamil culinary writing. Archives that I do hope will see greater attention among a broader scholarly community and public community of discourse and talking about these old cookbooks especially, right? And so my project will continue, both for the print era Tamil cookbooks, also for the earlier medieval cookbooks that I'm heavily invested in. And I look forward to our discussion to follow, fruitful conversations on the area of food history, a topic that is close to my heart and mind, and to my stomach as well. And so I just want to thank, here's another later cookbook. I want to thank the Tamil Heritage Trust and thank you for listening this far and for letting me share my work with you today.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Gutierrez, for that. You may now unmute you may now unmute yeah, that's right. Thank you, and thank you very much. That was a fascinating ride through centuries of Tamil food and food in India in general. Thank you so much. I must remind our viewers that it's now an unearthly 7 a.m. where you are, and we are particularly grateful for your joining us at this time and making time for this. Before we go to the questions that we have from the audience, I would like to ask you a couple of questions which I thought were interesting and not necessarily on the topic itself. But how did you pick food as your area of specialization? What drove that decision? And probably corollary to that, the other topic of your interest is animals and elephants and so on. So, and how do these two things go together, and how did they come together for you?
Okay, yes, thank you. Again, thank you for your invitation, Jim, and being able to be with everyone today. Are you able to hear me? Okay, you can
Yes,
hear?
yes, well, we can hear.
Good.
Please go ahead.
Good. So, why food, and particularly the preparation of food? Um, Everyone has the things that they're really attached to and preferences and so on. And even as a child, I would read cookbooks and I would read them from beginning to end. um, Quite curious, and I had always had a fascination for just reading the recipes. You know, you can imagine in your head the whole process, like I don't know, like you might imagine a ritual or something that you can I can figure out how everything is going to taste from looking at the recipe many times. So I don't know, everyone has their quirks. And yes, I guess I got into cooking at a fairly young age, definitely by middle school, high school, and always fascinated with cookbooks and started writing on food history through this angle. And then your second question, food and animals, or why these sorts of things. I mean, doesn't everybody love food? And the culinary cultures of especially South India are so rich and diverse, and these amazing flavors, herbs, greens and herbs bursting through. And on my first travels to South India, I was just fascinated and started taking cooking lessons daily for months. And so yeah, it was a logical thing for me to do. But the second layer to this is that, and also animals, right? Something that many people connect to, especially these um, great large mammals like elephants and so on. I've always been an animal lover and vegetarian and so on, but you know, the other part of this is that food for much of South Asian history is Pakashastra, and my work on elephants really is Gaja Shastra, and these are two sets of intellectual traditions, sciences, right? Shastras is science that fall broadly within traditions of actually Artha Shastra, like Niti Shastra, instruction for kings and kingship and polity. And so it's actually in the same subdivision of area of expertise, right? And a style of writing as well, especially for Sanskrit. Yeah.
Sure, thank you for that. One of the questions, one of the parts I found very fascinating in your presentation was the way the recipe for a dish changes over the centuries. And you talked of the appams, and elsewhere you've written of other dishes as well. You probably didn't mention it here, but I have read in one of your publications. You talk of an increasing quantity of sugar going into many of these dishes and the recipes. I found that fascinating. Is there something that you can share with us on that?
Well, as a historian, the project is always to be looking for continuities and change, shifts and change over time. Not only to find what stays the same, but really it's in what changes where you find the developments and more information about historical periods and shifts over time. So yeah, that's just the kind of information a historian looks for. And sugar as a particularly valuable item and something that India and South Asia had the technologies for processing, obviously very early. And it was through India that people, even as far as China, learned sugar processing techniques, right, through Buddhist monks that were traveling. So these were technologies for things that may seem everyday now. Everyone has sugar, right? Most people. But sugar was a very highly valued item, historically speaking. Even in the subcontinent, you would have different levels, whether you had jaggery and sugar and so on. And so it is a marker of, I was trying to trace sort of, was temple food, I was trying to think through, was temple food more valued or was it purely more valued and valuable because it's served in such quantities to the deity? So those sorts of questionings and research questions for my working through proportions of measures of sugar versus compared to other items in these early temple naivedyas.
Okay. Meenakshi has a question. She says, tamarind is often said to have been brought from Africa. Was tamarind already in existence in South India as well? And what does your research tell you? How early is it? Does it start appearing in the inscriptions and so on? I know you've done work on puli as an idea in terms of some of the dishes.
Yes, Meenakshi, thank you for your question. Really, this would be some other scholars' area of expertise because, yes, tamarind did enter the subcontinent from very, very early period, so prehistoric. And so it would be archaeologists who could tell you a better dating. If you look for something on the internet or scholarly work on the archaeobotanical record, you'll find good dating for tamarind seeds and tamarind in the record. But yes, we have we have definitely plenty of references by early sangam material mentioning tamarind that seems confidently tamarind and not just something sour, related word. But.
Okay. Here is a question from Johan Kurvilla, and he asks us, could you tell us what jackfruit was called in the inscriptions?
It's the same as now. It's balapalam, right? Bala, that's it. And you'll see it as palam. And in the case of the recipe that you saw here for this chidambaram gotsu, it is written as balapalam. And so it's ripened, or at least fairly ripe, right? And not just the kai, the unripened kind of, unripe. It's not a vegetable ever. Yeah.
Sure. Ramesh Gauri Raghavan, among the many who thanked you for laying to rest the Shambhaji equals sambhar myth, also wants to know, when do you start seeing ingredients like tomatoes and chilies appearing in Tamil cuisine?
Yeah, it's very late. And so that these are foods introduced in what is called the Columbian Exchange following the period of the Age of Discovery and travelers bringing a different sort of globalization. And so Columbian refers to Christopher Columbus. And so, yeah, certain foods were popularized somewhat earlier than others. I think potato was actually quite late, but this is all colonial period. You do find Mughal references to some of these earliest sort of colonial, not just food introductions, but things like turkey, right? The first turkey that was brought to the subcontinent as a bird, not to be eaten as an exotic bird. And so, it's not until 18th, 19th century. Oh, chili, you do get early. You can find, there's one of the Kannada saints has written already in the 16th century. I think it's a female. This is not my exact area of expertise. There's a Kannada saint who has written a sort of poem or ode to chili, like the green chili, hot chili pepper. That'll be the earliest, but you don't find that in the cookbooks. I have not found anything in these sort of late medieval cookbooks that would be up to 15th century. No mentions there, and then only much later. Yeah, what's pure colonial period or Raj.
What one question I had was, like these ingredients came into the recipes a little later, but from your study of inscriptions and earlier recipes, are there things which are missing, which are things that today we add commonly to the food, which we would not think of a particular dish without it today, but were there things that were missing? And on the converse, were there things that were added to dishes that we have today that's no longer added?
Yes, quite a lot. I don't know, when I read something like the Manasalasa, the 12th century, this is a Sanskrit recipe collection within the Royal Encyclopedia, I'm always surprised that there's so little reference to things like mustard seeds that we feel so dominates, right, South Indian cuisine. Just a couple mentions, right? But it's there. You get a lot more ginger and pepper and so on. What are things are missing for the temple material? I speculate that things that were not so highly valued, right? That would not be used in such big quantities, right? So you need to measure out, because it's coming from the temple granaries also, the amount of dal, the amount of rice or paddy, and so on. And then things like, I was always shocked, like, where's the curry leaf? Looking through all of these historical records, where is the curry leaf? It has to be there, right? And
You can't find the curry leaf anywhere. Is that what you're saying?
For temple, for Chorda records, no,
Temple
nowhere at all. And so my speculation is that this was just simply brought in from the temple gardens, like the Nandavanams that you would have belonging as part of the temple property, right? And so they would just bring in, right? Because you do get spices in the sense of dry spices. You get perungayam, you get, pepper and all these kinds of things. And so, some things are curiously missing. We do find curry leaf in the Nala Pakadarpana, which is the sort of 12th to 15th century Sanskrit cookbook. And so we do find plenty of curry leaf there, right? Quite a bit. So it definitely was being cooked with.
Okay.
Oh, and things that are, sorry, the second part of the question was things that are very dominant or that were
things that have been
past.
dropped now or from a recipe or from a dish completely.
Yes, I forgot the second part. The royal cookbooks have so much heavy use of camphor, musk, safflower, most likely for coloring the dish, right, as a dye. And so, people still cook with camphor, edible camphor. It's just not it's not as dominant as it was, and especially the royal manuals, but also the temple food. We do see camphor given as offering for Naivedya in the temple inscriptions, and that was a dominant taste, right? A really, really strong dominant taste, and we don't see that very much today.
Sure. And I also remember reading somewhere about your mentioning addition of fruits to some of the sweet dishes, the akara disal and the Trikkanamadu and so on, that you felt that the fruits or the bananas and the plantains that were added were probably dropped later on.
Yeah, we don't seem, at least to my knowledge, it's not quite as extensive. Banana, of course, you may find people adding to appam and things like that. But yeah, we have a lot more fruits, and a lot of, in the royal manuals in Sanskrit, a lot of sort of yogurts flavored with fruits, or with the addition of fruits. That's very, very common. And I guess you see that in lassi today, but not so much in yogurty fruits. Maybe that's what it is, just lassi.
Buttermilk was also commonly mentioned in royal manuals, isn't it, as Saundarya?
Yes, of course. This is a constant and a mainstay throughout, at least from the medieval period up to the modern period.
And staying on with ingredients, Ravi Shankar wants to know when asafoetida became an important part of the cuisine.
Yeah, I would have to speculate, definitely from the ancient period. It's a plenty in all of the medieval cookbooks. You find a great deal of use of hing or asafoetida.
Okay. Do you think that the measures, this is again from Saundarya, do you think that the measures of ingredients are found mostly in Tamil recipes, but are not there in written ones in Sanskrit? Is that a right observation? Or is it something to do with the period of writing, like you mentioned, the ancient texts may or may not have the measures, but subsequently from Chola period onwards, you start having measures kind of thing.
I think it's much more the second situation that you described. The temple inscriptions are a really rare exception because these were items with a fixed value, and the donor cared exactly how much money is spent on each thing, and the temple took care of finances. The temple was the bank of the village or town, and so they kept a tight record on the treasury, right? And so that's why we have such detailed measurements. It's not a language particular or language distinction that you find more measurements in Tamil. That's nothing like that. It's just this the case that the temple inscriptions were actually really concerning money. That's the
Sure,
public interest.
Sure. A couple of questions. One is from a Kerala name written in Malayalam that I can't read. And the other related question is from Prabhanjan's Tamil Treasures, it says, and they want to know if cooking was more gendered. Sorry, that's from Seema Kuti, which is historically where more men employed as cooks in places like palaces and other aristocratic homes in the past is something they want to know.
That's a good question, and something I am always looking for information for. Quite often in descriptions, you have this sort of gender neutral. I mean, plurals always default to masculine gender. And so it can be hard to trace. What we do have definitely is the same thing we see up to the present day, that celebrity chefs and master chefs are typically men. But this is, of course, something that's thematized historically, even in the epics, where we do have Bhima and Nala and princes and men cooking. And so also even in Kama Sutra, if you think Kama Shastra, in the Kama Sutra, any man about town, the Nargataka, the man that's supposed to be sort of elite, middle to high class gentleman, he needs to know the art of cooking, the science of cooking. And so in Kama Sutra commentaries, you do get recipes because this is a skill to impress people by, right? And so there is a gendered component. I have found in one or two works mentions particularly of female workers in royal kitchens. These are exceptions, and these are sort of like assistants, helping to cook. I don't think it would be only men cooking in palace kitchens, and that women were doing the lower division of labor. There were definitely women in cooking in kitchens, and we also see record of this in the Chorda inscriptions. We have females managing the temple kitchens, yes, supervising the activity. So there is you'll see both.
All right. Okay. Aruna Karod, she says, on a side note, is the Sanskrit sambhara for ground spice mix related historically or etymologically to sambal, ground spice mixes of Southeast Asia?
I've thought about that only a little bit. Thank you for your wonderful question. Most likely, because we do find in Southeast Asia quite many Sanskrit derived words, and just a little bit of variation. Sambarda, of course, can also be any sort of material used in preparation of something, right? So we see for a ritual, right? For Hindu ritual, sambarda would be the materials you gather together to conduct the ritual or rite. You also find what's terribly common, sambarda, as the things that you prepare to do something. So, if you're going to build a house, the sambarda would be gathering together wood. I don't know what else people used to build houses in the ancient period, but so that this was, you could also have usages of sambarda that were not only culinary. I don't want to create that false impression. I don't have a good answer for this sambal thing. We should look in an etymological dictionary for Southeast Asia and farther along.
Sure, I'm sure she'll be inspired to go take a look at that now. There was a question here. Just a moment. Okay, Padmaja Somanchi wants to know where their Naivedya offerings, vegetarian, or was there any evidence of a non-vegetarian offering too, considering that there were sacrifices in the early parts of Hindu worship?
Yes, very much so. Thank you for your question, because I probably have never written about this. Yes, you do find mentions of offerings of meat in the inscriptions, not terribly common. And you do find mentions of offerings of alcohol as well. And yeah, these are not Brahmanical temples, but we do have inscriptional records of this, certainly.
Sure. K. Subramaniam wants to know where vegetable oils as commonly used as ghee. If yes, in what part of the recipe are there any specifications?
Good question. You threw me off because I thought vegetable oil. I've never seen vegetable oil because taila is always sesame oil, and that's not really a vegetable. It's a seed oil. But it actually threw me off there. Sometimes we'll have indications for only ghee, but quite often the recipes will say ghee or oil, and the oil of default is sesame oil.
Okay. Let me look for some more questions too.
Lots of
There
great
are a lot
questions.
of people who thank you for bringing up, Samaitapar Meenakshi Amal, and people have mentioned that it was part of their wedding trousseau earlier. Geeta has mentioned that, and there's apparently a Malayalam equivalent of Mrs. Matthews' cookbook, where all Kerala brides were presented that as part of their wedding trousseau. So you set off some nostalgia among some of the members of the audience.
Very culturally important, very significant for the modern period. And it's just this curious Samael Newell that I have found reference to and would love to see. I make it an effort to have copies of every single old cookbook. And this one I have not found. There's also one other female authored cookbook from a woman living in Sri Rangam. And I would like to get my hands on that. It's very early. But...
Sure. So maybe one last question, and this says, this is from Gimli Bait. And it says, who was the intended audience for the printed books, and how, if at all, did the profile of the readers change over the years?
Good. Thank you for your question. These are wonderful questions because these are the primary scholarly questions. When I come to any text, you think, who was this written for, really? And sometimes the answer is obvious, and sometimes it can be quite hard, even for materials in Sanskrit. You're thinking, who would have been, really reading this as an audience or hearing and listening to it? For the print cookbooks, the authors often write in their introductions that they are written for women for teaching cooking. So it really is primarily the sort of reform in women's education. This is the project. And lots of mentions of this, especially for the Tamil material. This is, of course, what I've looked at most closely. And so, yeah, it seems quite evident that this was, of course, this is part of this late 19th century domestication. Of course, this was a sort of cultural defense under British Raj rule. Well, you're forced to live under some other hegemonic authority and power. And one of the few things you have control of is what you cook in your own house. And the men outside may be starting to wear foreign dress, like shirts and pants, like Shyam has today. But the women are going to be wearing the saris and maintaining the culture, right? And the women are going to be cooking the traditional food. What you do outside in the public may be more of bending to the British will and bending to the British cultural styles and values. But what you do inside your house, and so this is why you had such a strong project of domesticity, and that women had to stay home and cook. This is actually one of the direct things we see in the writing, because we also had in this late 19th century with the British Raj, we had a huge administrative apparatus. And so, what would have been, maybe middle class, upper middle class men were working in administrative positions, suddenly had quite a bit more money. There was this middle class, right? Suddenly families could afford to have somebody helping at home, somebody maybe cooking. And this was actually harshly criticized by these reformists, saying, no, the woman of the house should be cooking, should stay home and cook. We see this much more in Bengali material. But so this is actually directly part of the project of teaching women the traditional methods of cooking is just because you have new money, you shouldn't be going out, to eat in cafes and whatever. You should stay home and cook. But this was also a project of preserving cultures that are under threat from an imperial authority, right? So it's complicated. You need to stay home and cook what is really meaningful and valued here, and the things that we can do that are ours.
Sure. That's a very insightful response. Thank you so much for that. One last question on the ingredients, and we're done with all ingredients, I think, which is earliest mention of coconut oil. That's from Jaya Nair, who I'm assuming is using a lot of it at home.
That's good. I mean, I apologize. I do not read Malayalam, and I am sure I could give you a different response. I have actually never read of using coconut oil in Tamil cookbooks, nor in Sanskrit material. However, we do have plenty of recipes with coconut, and recipes where you'll be making coconut milk from mashing the fruit. And so even in Nalapakadarbana, you have recipes with coconut. So definitely the food was used. And this is one of those things where it's sort of community specific, right? Very community specific. So I'm sure if there's someone looking at early Malayalam cookbooks, you'll get a different answer. I haven't located any. I know they're there. It hasn't been a priority. The sort of Telugu Pakashastra and some of the others have been much more prominent for the early period.
All right. So thank you very much for that. What should we be looking forward to next from you in terms of, your next project or your publication, or in terms both on both your interests? I know there's the work going on the elephant side, and there's some work going on the food side. So what are we up for next?
I am always busily at work writing, and so food upcoming will be articles on royal cooking, royal cookbooks coming out relatively soon, and my book will be longer running on royal cooking and recipes. And so I think I mentioned mostly for medieval period, but also the Tamil cookbooks. I'll be pushing some of this material out soon. And for elephants, yes, I have an active project of working through Gaja Shastra and the whole range of this vastly ignored material. There's only one dissertation from 1979 written by a woman in Assam. Almost no one has bothered to work on this. Thomas Troutman, of course, and another scholar I'm in connection with, but has not published on it. So yeah, I'm doing the whole thing, working on capture and captivity of elephants, training of elephants, categories of elephants. I'm presently looking at a text that actually lists out prices for selling elephants, and in vast numbers. And so depending on the qualities and characteristics, the price of the elephant will differ. So in this case, and I can get a relatively firm dating range for this text, it seems clear that this would have been export, like elephants as chattel, selling, most likely foreign trade. This would be kind of more ancient period, or trade to other parts of India. So that's kind of what I'm actively working on now. Trade in elephants.
Wonderful. We'd love to have you back on Tamil Heritage Trust talks, and maybe have you talk about your elephants next time. So thank you very much.
It would be a pleasure.
Thank you very much for joining us. I know you have the rest of the day to catch up back at Austin. And thank you so much for joining us and giving us such a wonderful talk full of fascinating facts and rich insights. Thank you very much. And for our audience here, we'll be back next month with our next talk. You can look forward to receiving a message from us. Yeah. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Shyam, and thank you to the Tamil Heritage Trust.